We should not put too much stock into what happens in training camp. Still, some Jets players can give us peace of mind for the upcoming season if they perform well in camp. We'll discuss today on Locked On Jets.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It's Monday, July 29th, 2024, and I'm your host, John B. from GangGreenNation.com. Thanking you so much for making the show your first listen or first watch every day. Subscribe to the show for free on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts so you'll get new episodes as soon as they're posted. If you enjoy the show and are listening on the podcast source, please give it a 5-star review. If you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. It helps us out, helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. As the playoffs have wound down in basketball and hockey, the sports have stopped sportsing like we want them to. But this summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a booster bonus daily. That's right, there's something for everyone, every day, all summer long. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. Well, today on the show, we're going to talk about Jets training camp. And in particular, we're going to discuss players who can give us some peace of mind by performing well in training camp. Now, I want to emphasize that I think training camp results are frequently overstated. I think we put way too much stock into what happens in training camp. I mean, we talked about it last week. Just look at all the discussion around Allen Lazard having a big first day for the Jets in training camp. And now suddenly all these stories are coming back about the Lazard comeback tour. I'm not sure that's necessarily going to be the case. I don't think Lazard is necessarily going to live up to his contract now just because he happened to have a big first day of training camp. Now, that said, I think that there are some players who are maybe a little unproven or players who are trying to bounce back. And if they perform well in training camp, they could give the Jets and their fans some peace of mind as they enter the regular season. And we're going to start talking about what I mean by that. And the first player I'm going to talk about is Fashanu, who I think is an important player for the New York Jets this season. And, that's not really going out on a huge limb. When you draft a guy 11th overall, typically he's an important player for you. Now, he might be a little less important this year than he would otherwise be because he doesn't need to start. The Jets in the offseason acquired a couple of veteran tackles in Tyron Smith and Morgan Moses, who will be, at least at the start of the season, be the two starting tackles for this team. However, it's very likely Fashanu will be called upon. And I would say that about any team. I would say that in any situation, that the third tackle on the team typically will need to step up at some point for your team. Injuries happen a lot on the offensive line. It doesn't matter who you've got. It's just a spot on the field where bodies, tangle. Guys are constantly engaged. There's a lot of violence on the line. And some, bodies start moving around. You have to work through traffic. And unfortunately, sometimes you step in the wrong spot or some guy rolls on your leg and it causes injuries. It's very difficult to go through your career and be unscathed by injuries. DeBrickashaw Ferguson, who missed one snap his entire career, which is a trick play over the course of a 10-year stretch, that's an anomaly. Most offensive linemen are going to get hurt during the course of their career. You're very lucky if you make it through the season with both of your tackles playing 17 games apiece. And for the Jets, with a pair of 33-year-old tackles, that's even less likely than your typical team, especially when one of those tackles is Tyron Smith, who is a guy who, if he gives you 13 games, I think you're happy with it. If he gives you 75% of the snaps, you're happy with it because although all players get injured, all players do not get injured at an equal rate. And some guys are more durable than others. Now, across from Smith is Morgan Moses, who's been very durable, but he's getting older. And, there are two things I've noticed. The two biggest drivers, and consistently come across on when people study this in predicting injuries. Everybody can get injured, but some players get more injured than others. What are the things that lead players to, what are the things that makes a player more likely than someone else to be injured? In injury history and age. And Tyron Smith has both of them. Moses has been pretty durable through the course of his career. In fact, that's another. Moses has been extremely durable, but he missed games for the first time in a very long while last year. So the Jets, more than most teams, maybe more than any team, are probably going to need to lean on their third tackle this season. Now, that's different from throwing out a rookie to start. That is a different spot. And I like the situation the Jets have put Fashanu in where he can work on some things. He can work in the weight room, try and add some strength. Maybe there are a few. I think he's pretty sound technically. I've mentioned that there are a couple of things he might be able to work on technique wise. But it's a good situation for Olu Fashanu to be in. That said, the Jets will certainly. It's almost a guarantee the Jets are going to have to call on him to start a couple of games this year at the very least, and you hope not more. Again, I think if Tyron Smith gives you 13 games and you have to lean on Fashanu for 4, you'd be delighted by that. The Tyron Smith signing was a signing with very high upside, and you hope if he gives you any game he gives you, he's going to give you probably going to give you very high level play, and you hope he's healthy for most of the season. You especially hope he's healthy if the Jets make the playoffs. If he does, that could change everything on the offensive line. But I think it's very tough to doubt that he will miss time at some point this year. That's where Fashanu comes in. And rookie tackles, there tend to be two categories. One is the guys who don't play spectacular, but they don't destroy you. They're just kind of okay. And then the other categories are the guys who destroy you. And just because you're in the latter category as a rookie doesn't necessarily mean your career is doomed. There are some guys who, play really badly as rookies, but players get better in years 2, year 3, year 4, especially between year 1 and year 2. The question is which of the two will Fashanu be? Fashanu, the Jets do not need him to be spectacular. The way the Jets handled the tackle position in the offseason, if all goes well, that means that's exactly what that means. It doesn't mean that Fashanu necessarily needs to play spectacular football, because your third tackle doesn't need to be a star. The third tackle needs to be a guy who can hold the fort, a guy who can play credible football. And fortunately for the Jets, that's about like the most you can expect from a guy you draft, even a guy you draft in the first round. I mean, take a look across the league. I mean, it's very, very rare. It's possible. I mean, look, it's always possible you get a guy who plays at a Pro Bowl level as a rookie, but it's not something you count on. It's one of those things. I think there are the things that are likely, and the things that you can't count on. And if you get it, it's a bonus. And we're talking about Fashanu playing well to the point where he's making a Pro Bowl. That would be a bonus. I don't think that's the type of thing the Jets would really be able to count on. So I think it's a question of, can Fashanu hold the fort? And that's why I think he's a guy worth watching at these preseason training camp practices. I don't want to overstate the significance of these things, because I feel like every year there are storylines that come out the first, second week of training camp, and you forget about them, and then by the time the season comes, they're long gone, and they almost become a punchline because they're so irrelevant to what happens during the season. They're so at odds with what actually happens for your team during the course of the season. But I think if Fashanu looks like he belongs, and that's that more than anything, if he's getting up against the second unit, because they'll be playing a lot against the second unit in these practices, and he looks like he's just stonewalling them, that's what you want to see. Because a guy who would hold his own against first teamers is typically going to look pretty dominant against second teamers. So it looks like he belongs maybe a half step to a step above that. So certainly the Jets have bigger things in mind for Fashanu in the future. He is the long-term left tackle of this team. That's what the plan is, at least. I don't think there's any question about that. So I think that we're talking about the years of Fashanu's career. Year 1's probably going to be by far the least important, because everything that follows is going to be more important. Because starting in 2025, he is the franchise left tackle, and the Jets are going to hope for the next 7 to 10 years after that he just has that position on lockdown. The way they haven't had it on lockdown since the guy I mentioned earlier, the Brickishaw Ferguson, was on the team. This year, fortunately, expectations are a little bit lower. Can he hold the fort? Maybe we'll start to see that in practice. Now, here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we're going to talk about a guy who's been receiving some negative marks from some in the fans and media during these at least in the early stages of practices. I don't think it's fair. I still think that I think his production is worth watching more than who he's lining up with. And if that doesn't make sense, I'll explain it to you, continuing here on this Monday edition of the Locked On Jets podcast. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by FanDuel. I love sports. I love them so much that I never want them to stop. I'm sure you feel the same way, but of course, the basketball and hockey playoffs have wound down, and now we get fewer games, and the sports are not sportsing like we want them to. But FanDuel helps us keep the sports going whenever we want. All we have to do is open up the app and dream up bets anytime we are in the mood. And this summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a booster bonus daily. That's right, there's something for everyone every day, all summer long. If you're a baseball fan locally, Yankees, Mets, maybe you're not a local baseball fan. I mean, you could be a Jets fan and root for another baseball team. FanDuel's the place to get in on the action. Of course, the Jets are underdogs week 1 in San Francisco. You can bet on that. You can bet on over-unders for Jets wins this season. It's all on FanDuel. So head on over to FanDuel.com and start making the most out of your summer. FanDuel, official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball. Thank you for making Locked On Jets your first listen or first watch every day. A big shout out to you, everydayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets with new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. Today, we're talking about players who, if they perform well in training camp in the weeks ahead, they could give Jets fans and the team itself some peace of mind. I've talked about the third tackle. Now I want to talk about the third player at another premium position. It's actually the third player at the position that goes up against the tackles, and that's defensive end. And that's Will McDonald, the guy we've talked about a lot on the show over the last few weeks and even the last few months. When the offseason began, the moves the Jets were making, it was tough to see where McDonald had a spot. And fortunately for him, the Jets made some moves. They let Bryce Huff go to Philadelphia. They traded for Hassan. They traded John Franklin Myers to Denver, and suddenly there's a spot now for Will McDonald. Now the spot's opened up even bigger with the Hassan Reddick holdout. Now, there was some good news on that front over the weekend. There were some reports that Jets and Reddick are making some progress on potentially, figuring out this whole contract mess that the Jets and Reddick have gotten themselves into. And I am still an optimist on this when it comes to Reddick taking the field and playing well this season. I still think you got to look at the incentives. What's in everybody's best interest? I think it is. It's still in everybody's best interest for Reddick to go out there and play great, and chips fall where they may this offseason. But McDonald was going to be a key player anyway because of how Robert Saleh rotates his defensive ends in and out. I mean, really, if you look at the stats, you look at the playing time numbers, I think you can make a strong argument. The Jets essentially have three starting defensive ends. No, not all three of them start the game, but three of them essentially get starter shares of the snaps in a typical Robert Saleh defense. So McDonald's role was going to be elevated. Last year, it was kind of a redshirt year. And McDonald was an older rookie already. So, he's kind of running out of runway here when we're talking about taking off, because he's nearing the end of his athletic prime and he's got to start producing this year. And the Jets have put a lot on his plate. The John Franklin Myers trade opens up a lot of snaps for him. It also opens up another role, who's going to help stop the run on the defensive end. I'm not sure necessarily that's going to fall to McDonald, but getting after the quarterback certainly will. Well, the Reddick situation also is a reminder of why it's significant, why McDonald's play is significant, because if Reddick's not there, McDonald then becomes one of the top two defensive ends on the team. And as significant as it is being the third defensive end, being one of your top two guys is even more important. Maybe not as much for playing time, but just in terms of, what you're expecting from your pass rushers, what you need your pass rushers to give you. All three guys are going to see, your top three guys are going to see a lot of playing time, but you're looking for more sacks typically from your number one and number two guy. Now, early in camp, we saw a small scale freak out from some in the fan base because Michael Clemens was reportedly getting snaps over McDonald. And some people are now jumping to conclusions over this. I would say a couple of things about this. First of all, let's see how camp plays out. McDonald could still go out and play really well in the days and weeks ahead. And if he does that, then it maybe calms down some of the nerves with the Reddick situation, which is why the show is focused on who gives the Jets peace of mind. Beyond that, you can't read too much into this stuff. Now, I don't think it's fair to say, McDonald starting with the twos, nothing to see there. Clemens, getting snaps over him. I don't think it's fair to say that. But I think there are levels to which it matters. For me, it's more of that's interesting. That's worth keeping an eye on. But you have to remember, coaching staffs are trying new things out in training camp. The coaching staff may be trying to light a fire under somebody. They might be trying to light a fire under Clemens by giving him first team snaps. Maybe they're trying to light a fire under McDonald by saying you're behind Clemens. They may just be testing things out. They may be testing out a tackle. Maybe they're testing out Fashanu. They want him to get a tougher matchup against McDonald when McDonald plays with the second teamers. There are lots of different potential explanations to this. So I don't think it's fair to go crazy over something like this. I think it's worth watching. I think the people saying this is completely irrelevant, I wouldn't go that far. But it's all about finding the right level to focus on this. And I think that what we saw from many in the fan base and the media was taking it a little too far. It's a situation where it's still July. We're not even in August yet. So it's a bit early to be making proclamations. You have to remember, there were points where Joe Tippmann was working with the third team last year in training camp. So I think that it's just something that tends to get overblown because we're in the early stages of training camp. There's not a whole lot to talk about. Um, there's just a lot. There's still a long way to go, and McDonald has an opportunity to go out there. If you're getting reports every day that he looks great, first of all, it means that the Jets, when Reddick gets back, will have 3 pass rushers. That you'll be feeling really good about that. It'll also make you feel better if this Reddick thing draws out a little bit longer, because I could be wrong about this. This Reddick situation, it could linger. It could become a longer term problem. We don't know how far Hassan Reddick is willing to take this. I think it's going to be okay, but the operative phrase there is I think. I'm making an educated guess. And while that is what I believe, I have been wrong in the past about certain things. I have been wrong about the severity of certain situations in the past, I have to admit. I mean, I didn't think Reddick would hold out of training camp, if I'm being honest with you. I figured this would have been resolved by now. So it's entirely possible that this could last longer with Reddick than I was expecting. And if you see her stories that McDonald's going out there playing really well every day, you're going to feel better about it. It's not going to be as dire. And I don't know. I'm finished talking about leverage after last year. I don't ever want to use the word leverage. Who has leverage in the phrase "who has leverage in negotiations" ever again. But it's the type of thing that could either make the Jets feel better about things or worse about things with Reddick. It could help indicate where they draw the line, maybe where they don't draw the line. These are just things that are worth considering. It's better for everybody if McDonald goes out there and looks like he's starting to put the pieces together. We know that McDonald has interesting physical tools, especially that arm length, because that arm length helps you disengage from blockers. Blockers like to latch onto you. They may be holding, but there's holding on every play. Offensive linemen always hold. Question is, if they hold the right way, they get away with it. Well, McDonald, if he learns how to use his arms in his pass rushing technique and develops some counter moves, he'll be able to disengage and he'll be able to be an effective pass rusher. And I think what we're going to find out over the next few weeks in the reports that we'll get will indicate, whether he's on the right track or not. Just the first step of the story, though. That's why, I don't want to overstate how significant training camp is, but I do think there's some peace of mind if Will McDonald goes out and plays well. Now, here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll turn our attention to one last premium position. And you're noticing a theme here. It's about depth players just making you feel better about that your team has some degree of insurance. And we're going to talk about Aaron Rodgers as pass catchers, because there are a couple of guys who could step up and make us feel better about an injured player returning this year. And we'll go into more detail on that, continuing here on this Monday edition of Locked On Jets. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by Gametime. Gametime is an authorized ticket marketplace in Major League Baseball, which makes getting tickets faster and easier. Prices on the Gametime app actually go down the closer it gets to first pitch. With killer last-minute deals, all-in prices, views from your seat, and their lowest price guarantee, Gametime takes the guesswork out of buying Major League Baseball tickets or any sort of ticket you want. I love Gametime. I've used it a number of occasions. You can get any sport you want. You get concerts. You can get theater. You name it. It's on Gametime. I can't get over how easy it is to use. I don't believe the deals you get, and you get a picture of the view from your seat again, so there are no surprises when you arrive. It's one of my go-to apps for buying tickets. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNFL, LOCKEDONNFL, one word with no space, for $20 off. Download Gametime today. Last-minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. This is the Locked On Jets podcast on this Monday, talking about players who can give the Jets and their fans some peace of mind if they perform well at training camp in the weeks ahead. And I'm not a big believer in obsessing over individual practices. I mentioned this on Friday. I think you have to treat training camp as kind of like a long story. I think you have to kind of treat it like you're reading a book. The book doesn't last one page. Each day of training camp is like a page of the book. You wouldn't draw conclusions over 1 day or 2 days or even 3 days. And, I mentioned earlier in the show that some of the discussion over Alan Lazard's gotten a little bit out of control. And I mentioned the other day that I was impressed by the Jets because it didn't feel like they were really feeding the Alan Lazard redemption story. Didn't feel like they're trying to sell the narrative. Oh, Rodgers is back now. Suddenly he's going to unlock Lazard. Lazard's going to go back to being good like he was in Green Bay, because Lazard wasn't that good in Green Bay, and because Zach Wilson wasn't the reason Lazard couldn't run a route last year. He wasn't the reason Lazard dropped a bunch of passes last year. But Mike Williams is coming back from an injury. And, the Jets are very confident he's going to be back for week 1. But I think you want to have depth at wide receiver because your Williams injury, or heaven forbid, a Garrett Wilson injury, away from being in a similar situation to where you were last year, unless you have better depth players behind him. And I'd throw Malachi Corley in the mix. Corley now could get some extra reps going forward because Xavier Gibson's banged up a little bit. So I think those are the two guys, and for the next couple of weeks, worth watching at the wide receiver position. And again, it's just about finding the right balance. I don't want to act like Lazard's going to be great because he's off to a good start. I don't want to act like it's nothing though. But what I need to see is consistency. I think that to develop a narrative, there needs to be a reason for a narrative. There needs to be a long stretch where something's building, and then it needs to continue into the preseason games, and it needs to continue into the regular season. This is kind of the starting point. And I'll be honest with you, I don't know that I'm necessarily going to buy into a Lazard resurgence until I see it, because quite frankly, I don't think he was all that great in Green Bay. Corley's an interesting case just because of, he's coming from that system where he didn't really run routes. I mean, there's no other way to put it. It was really just, he caught a bunch of screens. He was the yak king because he caught a bunch of screens. So the Jets, I think, believe that he can be more than that. Jets think they can develop him into a route runner. So I'm going to be very interested to hear how Corley's route running is coming along. I think that they're going to find a role in the offense for him. He's the type of guy, I don't like the Deebo Samuel comparison, because Deebo Samuel, if he wasn't in San Francisco, would be somewhere else. He'd be a really good receiver because he's a great route runner. The biggest question with Corley is, how quickly can he learn route running? But they will figure out ways, I think, to scheme up some Deebo Samuel-esque touches. They'll get him the ball out of the backfield. They'll throw him screens because, again, Yak King caught a million screens last year. But I think the more interesting question for Corley, or the more significant question for Corley, is how quickly can he come along as a conventional receiver? We know that they'll be able to diagram some things for him, but can he be a regular receiver? Can he be a guy who wins out of the slot? It's going to be tough because the slot has very complex routes. Corley, again, didn't really run routes in college. I mean, you just think about something as simple as an option route where you can run left or right, and you pretty much have to read the leverage of the defender and cut at the precise moment. Aaron Rodgers is very particular in what he wants out of his wide receivers. A rookie like Corley, it could be a bit of a learning curve, but some guys just take to it really quickly. Some guys develop chemistry really quickly. I'm sure the Jets would love for Corley to be one of those guys. And if they get that, then this receiving group can look okay. Now, I don't think you ever win or lose the Super Bowl because you're your number 3 receiver, and that's even true. I know a guy can make a clutch catch in a playoff game or a Super Bowl like that as the number 3 receiver, but I think your overall production at that position doesn't make or break your team. Again, it's more about insurance, and especially with a guy coming back from a serious knee injury in Mike Williams, it's something worth watching. It's something worth considering that, as things stand right now, if everybody stays healthy at wide receiver, I think the Jets are in fine shape. I think that, Garrett's a good number 1. Williams is an excellent number 2. And your number 3 guys are guys who are just, they're just kind of okay. If you suffer an injury, though, and look, I mean, the Jets aren't alone in this. It's not like the Jets are the only team that, it's very rare that a team can suffer an injury to a top 2 receiver and thrive. But it's more, do you have guys who can at least hold the fort? If somebody suffers a medium-term injury, can you have a guy who can at least be credible enough through a couple games, or 2 guys who can combine to kind of replace somebody's production in the aggregate? These are the things worth watching. And look, we won't have hard answers on this. Again, it's about keeping things in perspective. Going crazy over 1 day of Allen Lazard, or 2 days or 3 days of Allen Lazard, that's not helpful to anybody. But if you can build a narrative, if you can consistently see guys be successful, then that's where you start to think maybe you got something here. And at least, gives you a little bit more peace of mind, and through a relatively uncertain situation. I don't want to overstate the uncertainty because the Jets do think Williams will be back, but you hope that things settle themselves down, and you hope that, you feel good even if you feel good about any situation because you like your depth. Anyway, that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoyed the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you enjoy the show and are listening on a podcast source, give it a 5-star review. If you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. It helps us out, helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Enjoy your Monday, everybody. We'll be back tomorrow to talk more Jets.